on behalf of J Street and all of the participants of this panel. As you know, the question that we're going to be discussing today, the title is Behind the Scenes in the Battle to Protect Democracy. I think what... Am I too loud? Can you hear me? Okay. Behind the scenes in the battle to protect democracy, we have three extremely interesting speakers tonight, or this morning. Just feels like tonight. They're people who know very deeply and intensely what is going on with the progressive NGO movement, what the issues are, what the differences are among them, and what their projection is for going forward and hope for the future. What I would like to do is introduce them all at once and then ask each of them to speak for 5 or 6 minutes. I may then have a couple of questions to ask them to tease out a few things that they said, and then we'll open it for questions to the audience. I expect that this will be a very civilized bunch, so we can do it with you asking live questions. Do we have a microphone to pass around? Okay, so if you'll, after they've made their presentations, if you'll line up behind the mic. As usual, I'd ask you to make it a question, not a speech. And if anybody is actually making a speech, forgive me in advance for being rude, because I will cut you off. I would like, before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to introduce Danny Sokach, who is the head of the New Israel Fund. Danny is a true hero to all of us. He has injected such wonderful life into the New Israel Fund. As I said to Aviva Meyer not too long ago, it's not my mother's New Israel Fund anymore. So I think and of course my mother never belonged to the New Israel Fund, but that's okay. So he's done spectacular things. Okay, let me introduce the panelists in the order in which they're going to speak. The first speaker is Hagai Elad, who is the head of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. Oh, there's Aviva back there. The ACLU of Israel, as I call it, and probably many of you think of it that way. Hagai is the executive director. He's only been on the job again for a couple of years and taken ACRI into spectacular and amazing new directions. He was the first executive director of the Jerusalem Open House for Pride and Tolerance in Jerusalem, the LGBT Community and Advocacy Center. He was born in Haifa. He was a pre-doctoral fellow at Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics in Cambridge, Boston, Massachusetts. He completed a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in astrophysics at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's published, can you imagine that, an astrophysicist who's a human rights activist? That's pretty unique. He's published many articles on Arab and Jewish relations and equality in Israel, LGBT rights, and more. He most recently contributed a chapter to the book Where Here, Language, Identity. I'm sorry, I got this screwed up, so I'll skip it. So, welcome to Hagai. Actually, I'll ask Hagai to speak, and then I'll introduce Danny and give you his bio also. Hagai.
Thank you and welcome, and I apologize for my academic background. I promise you that it's not going to be part of this presentation. Oops. Okay, astrophysics isn't that exciting. Let's be careful. Okay, before I say anything else, I want to say just a few words about the keynote speaker of tomorrow's gala, Naomi Chazan. I think it's directly related to the topic of this panel. I mean, we've gone through a very rough year this past year. There have been many attacks on human rights activists, human rights NGOs in Israel. But if there was one person that personifies that attack, one person that stood bravely and courageously in the face of all of those attacks, it's Naomi Chazan, and we should all thank her. for her leadership and her courage and what she has done for the entire community of human rights and civil society in Israel and for the New Israel Fund in Israel and abroad. Thank you, Naomi. Okay, so some historical perspective. 2 years ago, we are just now exactly 2 years into the current government in Israel. But around 2 years ago, something broke in Israel. We're talking about caste-led, we're talking about treatment of Palestinians, and we're talking about the campaign, the election campaign at the time that really mainstreamed racism, Israel Beitenu, the loyalty citizenship campaign, that has mainstreamed racism in Israel in ways that existed before, but were never a part of mainstream political thinking and leadership in Israel, the way they have become after the elections. And that is a point in time, 2 years ago, but it's a point in time because the basis for what happened later on, opening the floodgates on anti-democratic legislation in the Knesset, further entrenchment of the occupation and of racism in Israel, expansion of social economic gaps and so on, are all a result of not just this government and not just these 2 years. And we shouldn't make it easier for us in thinking that if we only undo Israel Beitenu, if we only go back to the glorious days of 2 years ago, everything will be dandy and perfect. 40 years of occupation is not the work of Netanyahu and Lieberman, and 60 years of de facto second-class citizenship of Israeli Arabs are not the work of Netanyahu and Lieberman. So Israeli society has been on this slippery slope for many years already, and we had our work cut out for us even before the current wave. What we also should not confuse ourselves is also to let the current government set the human rights agenda by continuing to keep us busy on their endless list of ridiculous, proto-fascist, anti-democratic bills that they're suggesting day in and day out. Now, we can stand here very proudly a week after we've successfully defeated the McCarthy relic reincarnation of anti-human rights parliamentary inquiry committee in Israel. We've won a round. It's good to win rounds. It's better to win rounds than to lose rounds. But if we were here a month from now, then, you know, there will be another round. And if I were standing here after we've lost this last round, that would not have meant that we've lost Israeli democracy. It meant that we've lost a round. And we should all understand that we are in this for the long run. It's going to take a while longer. It's going to take more than just outlasting this current government. And in the meantime, we should do two things. One is continue to win these rounds, and also not to hold our heads too low when we lose the occasional round, which will happen. In 2 years of anti-democratic legislation, you know how many bills they've successfully passed out of the more than 20 initiatives that they tried? 0. That's their success rate so far. 0. We'll do our best to keep it at that level. But that's their agenda. We have a different agenda. And we will celebrate our victories not when they give up on yet another anti-democratic initiatives, but when they start actually advancing the agenda that has kept the entire human rights community in Israel busy for decades before Netanyahu and Lieberman and Eli Yishai. And end for the occupation. Full equality for all Israeli citizens. Narrowing, closing the social economic gaps. Respect for human rights. Democracy. That was the agenda. That continues to be the agenda. And we should be steadfast in staying committed to that while taking care of the stuff that they're trying to level on us so that we're busy handling their agenda. The other thing that has happened during these last 2 years is while much of the anti-democratic dynamic has happened in the Knesset, in the parliament, much of the pro-democratic dynamics happened outside of the Knesset. And there have been several initiatives, successful initiatives, in building pro-democracy, pro-human rights constituency in Israel. This is happening by the New Israel Fund, this is happening by ACRI, this is happening by Solidariyut, and there are other initiatives. We've taken to the streets time and again, and that has been successful. That has been successful in raising issues, not in stopping the evacuation of Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah, but in making an issue out of Sheikh Jarrah through the work of Solidariyut. That has been effective in the big demonstrations in Tel Aviv against the Loyalty Oath Bill, against the anti-human rights inquiry committees. Both initiatives were defeated after massive demonstrations of close to, some of them, 10 and 20,000 people demonstrating on these values in Israel. So we are effective in building that camp. It's a process. 20,000 is great. It's far from where we were 2 years ago. It's far from where we need to be in order to really undo this tide and take the country in a different direction. But building that constituency is a process that is taking place. When we do the Human Rights March every year now, it's already a tradition, right? 2 years, now it's already a tradition in Tel Aviv. On December 10 every year, now for the second year, with 10,000 participants, that's a day when we're setting the agenda, because that's not a response to what they're doing. It's a day when we, in the fullest, are saying together, Jews and Arabs and everyone in Israel, that that's the kind of future that we want for our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hagai. Danny Ben-Simon is a member of the Knesset. He is a former journalist. I saw that he said, I think you were quoted in a newspaper interview, as saying, "I entered journalism to help shape Israeli society. For years I never missed an opportunity to turn a periscope on that other invisible Israel. I used any available platform to warn of the increasing inequality and loss of solidarity. I'm not sure I succeeded." In 2008, Mr. Ben-Simon decided to leave journalism and run for the Knesset. He said, "Because we've had too many wars, too many dead and injured, and because there's too much poverty, too much misery, and too many young people with no future, I want to change that reality, so I'm jumping in." He was a member of the Labour Party and chairman of Labour's Knesset faction. In October 2009, he resigned as chairman, correct me if I'm wrong, and began pressuring the party to leave the coalition. Last month, he announced that he was leaving the Labour Party to establish an independent, single-member faction in response to his failure to persuade the party to leave the government. Danny Ben-Simon.
I always need something in my hand, because you never know. I never use it, but you know, in case. Yes, I did leave the journalism. Was, I think, a good decision. You know, one has to come to a conclusion when the end is the end, but I joined the Labour Party. And when I asked my editor-in-chief in Haaretz, he said, "Why are you leaving? Are you going to television?" I said, "No, I'm going to politics." He said, "Where? Which party?" I said, "Labour." He said, "Did you see a doctor?" And I think I should have taken his advice, because it's been 2 years of hell. But Barak is not with us, so it's a kind of resurrection for me personally and for the party. And as I said before, he went to his natural home, and I hope he does well. Listen, the issue I spent the last 2 years in the Knesset, and I can speak to you about the mood of democracy and lack of democracy, but I won't do it. I'm in an optimistic mood this morning. I slept in Washington. I don't know what happened, but you know, you wake up in a different mood. And I must say that this is what's going on in Israel in the last few years, is part of the shaping of the state of Israel, of the society. It's not just Lieberman, as you said. It's not just Netanyahu, but it's a battle for the face of Israel. And it's a huge battle, ideological battle, which democracy is part of it. But the issue is this, you know, you have 1.5 million people who came from the former Soviet Union. They want their voice to be heard. And they are now in parliament, the third largest party. And they're making a difference. Unfortunately, not in a positive way, in my eyes. And you have, of course, the challenge of, I think we are getting closer to peace. We are at the beginning of the end of this conflict, in my eyes. As I said, as I wasn't said, everybody knows. we have solved something like 95–96% of the conflict. The remaining 4% is what's holding peace. And this 4% will make a huge difference for the Israelis in the future. What kind of state are we going to be? Like the US, like France, or are we going to be something, I don't want to use the word Jewish ghetto, but something, you know, like Barak said, a villa in the jungle, a villa with no friends around. Are we going to be closer to the Arabs, the Palestinians, or are we going to close the state, the country? So Israel is being defined today and redefined. But to me, the major threat to democracy is the biggest conflict in Israel today, is between the believers and the non-believers, is between the religious and the secular, is between those who created Israel and those who want to take over. And they are extremely strong. They have the land and they have the Bible. Too powerful. I mean, what's more powerful than that? It's an atomic bomb. And on this, they know that we are getting closer. And they know that if Netanyahu is holding peace, you know, but the next one maybe might sign an agreement. What will be of the holy places? What will be of Jerusalem? What will be of this of the biblical land, which 25% of Israelis believe that this is Israel? Hebron and Nablus and Jericho and everything. So the battle for democracy is beyond the issue of democracy, because there is a vibrant democracy in Israel, and I can assure you, in terms of what can you say, how can you live, it's freedom more than I know France quite well. It's much more than France. I won't say more than the US, but just a guess here. But this is to be known. This is a battle for the future of Israel, for the face of Israel, and for its character, which will be a liberal state based on the Supreme Court, on the Parliament, on freedom of speech, or will it be a state based on rabbis? I'm not joking. Just 2 weeks ago, the police called a rabbi to be investigated. He said, no, because I don't recognize you. I believe, I trust, I mean, God has given me this and this and that. And this is a battle between, you know, God and freedom. Can they live together? I think they can. But some 20% of the Israelis, you know, place a challenge on the face of Israel. And this is something that you should be involved, because most of you are liberal. And this is not something I can say about Israel. And I miss the input of American Jews. We hear mostly of American Jewish organizations. Foxmen and Foxmen and Foxmen and Foxmen, and did I mention Foxmen? And all these others who come to Israel with a kippah, without a kippah, and they have one view of American Jews, which is, as I said, most Israelis never heard of J Street. Because they know all these faces that come from America, and they portray the wrong image of America. And this is, in my eyes, a battle for the future of my sons, of my kids, of the future of all of us. Will it be run by the democratic system, the Supreme Court, the judges, the politicians, the parliament, or by the rabbis and the Bible? And as I said, you know, I heard a year ago, and it was published, the Minister of Justice, Professor Yaakov Neiman, a prominent jurist, who said in a close meeting, I hope the day will come when Israel will be run by a Sanhedrin. This is a guy who is the justice minister. He has the biggest law firm in Israel. He had a kippah, but his dream is to make Israel a halachic state. And this is the challenge of democracy. And that's why we all, French Jews and American Jews, and everywhere, have to be involved in this war the day after peace. Because it will come. Maybe next year or 2 years from now. And then we will get into our identity when we make peace with the Palestinians, because it will project on the way we live with our neighbors and outside of Israel. And that's why it's not just democracy, it's not just Lieberman, it's not just the New Israel Fund, with all due respect. But it's the face of Israel. It's if you want, Zionists will stop the day when we make peace. Can we live together? Can we form a society? Can we form a cohesive society? Can we live together, religious and non-religious, and to add with it? There's a bus now going in Jerusalem, a new train or whatever, with kind of segregation between men and women. This is not something that is Israeli. We cannot live with it. But we are getting to these issues. Men and women cannot sit together. This is the biggest challenge on the character of Israel. Are we going to be like you, or maybe like states that are being discussed here about Iran or something like this? This is the challenge, and we all have to take part with all intensity in order to shape the right character of Israeli society for the years to come. Thank you very much.
I've ridden on that bus, it's scary. Naomi Chazan absolutely needs no introduction in this group, but nevertheless, I'll give her a brief introduction. Some of the things I was going to say, she told me not to say, so I'm not going to say them. Naomi is a great heroine for all of us, as we have already heard from Hagai, and celebrate her today and celebrate her tomorrow and always. Naomi went to Columbia University and also the Hebrew University. She headed the Truman Institute for Advancement of Peace at the university. She was a member of the Israeli delegation at the UN Conference on Women. She is the president of the, or was the president of the Israel branch of the Society for International Development, founder and member of the board of the Israel Women's Network, and vice president of the International Association of Political Science. In '92, Naomi was elected to the Knesset on the merits list. She retained her seat in the '96 election and was made a deputy speaker. She was re-elected again in '99, remained a deputy speaker until losing her seat in the 2003 election. She became the chair of the board of the New Israel Fund 2 years ago, and I can't say often enough that she is a heroine to me and to probably everybody in this room. Naomi Chazan.
Boker Tov.
Boker Tov.
Wow. Two introductory comments. There are no heroines or heroes. All the people who fight for democracy in Israel are heroes and heroines, and citizens and sympathizers, and people who care about Israel. So don't elevate one person over another, and think, if Hagai Elad could go from astrophysics to getting his feet on the ground, all of us can. Secondly, I must admit, finally a dream came true. I've been dying to come to J Street. So I want to thank you. Now my net time starts, so I will be rapid and I think somewhat provocative. I would like to suggest to you, as Hagai did, that Israel is facing its most profound identity challenge since the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And the heart of this challenge is Israel's capacity to protect and safeguard and nurture its democratic character. We will not have survived if we hadn't been a democracy, and we will not survive if we do not sustain our democracy. I think it's very clear that in the 21st century, Jewish values and the future of Israel and democracy come together. They cannot be separated apart. They should not be. Having said that, The democratic issues in Israel are not only the tyranny of the majority and the inability to protect our minorities, nor are they the attempt to narrow and constrict personal liberties like freedom of speech and freedom of association. The democratic challenges are also deep. They are about the unraveling of the rules of the game, the inability to sustain the rule of law, and they're about the fact that people are questioning whether there might not be a contradiction between democracy and safety and security. That is a democratic crisis. Israel is in democratic recession, and Hagai was absolutely correct to highlight that. It takes different forms. Sometimes it's religious, secular, sometimes it's Arab Jewish, sometimes it's men and women, but there is a real challenge to Israel's democracy. Now, I must admit that I have been pondering for the past year and some, not only why this is taking place, but why now? And I think it is absolutely imperative that each one of you think about the causes for this phenomenon and for the timing. Now, it's easier for me to explain the reasons for why it's happening, but I'm not sure it's so simple to explain the timing. So I'll run through the reasons very quickly. Number one, demographics. Some of us have more children, some of us have less children, some of us have no children, and the Israeli demographic scene is moving in a certain direction. I don't like demographic explanations for social phenomena, and I suggest not to take it too seriously. But there are other reasons. A second reason can and should be that there is and has been a political collapse of the left in the last few years, actually in the last decade. And you know, when there is not proper political representation of progressive forces, you get the results. I think you remember that from a few years back. Okay, that's another reason. A third reason is that life in Israel is good, by and large, if you have a job and a decent income and a house. Now, it's true that 1/3 of Israelis, almost, living close to the poverty line or below the poverty line. But nevertheless, seems that there's no real incentive to change, and therefore, if things are going well, why change? But that's not much of an explanation, is it? I think there are two other explanations that are much more powerful. Number one, the non-resolution of the Arab-Israel conflict, and specifically of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, means that one has to find excuses for ruling over somebody else against their will. And if that doesn't whittle away in the democratic ethos, I don't know what does. And the final explanation is, very simply, fear. I think you recognize it. We Jews, and especially Israelis, we've gotten so strong and so powerful in the last decades. But we walk around with a siege mentality. We are vulnerable, we believe we're vulnerable, and no matter how strong we are, we will always be a mite paranoid. And I want you to know that paranoia is a very bad guide to democracy and to human rights and to civil rights. So take all those explanations together. I think we can explain why democratic recession is happening, but we still cannot explain the timing. And I would like to suggest something that came to me in the middle of the night because of jet lag. So put me on a plane and at least you get a new thought. I think that the timing is directly related to the present Israeli government's response to the gradual isolation of Israel and the growing delegitimation of Israel. Why? Because if the isolation of Israel is taking place, and it is tangible, it is palpable, the government has two choices. It can accept the fact that possibly this is happening because of its own policies, or it has to find another explanation, and the other explanation is that one has to find a scapegoat, somebody from within that is undermining Israel's standing. It's so much easier not to accept responsibility for your own actions. It is so much easier to blame, to put the blame on somebody. You know, for the past decade, we have blamed Arab citizens of Israel for their own victimhood. But when it's getting worse outside, we start blaming the left. And you know what? That serves, I would like to suggest to you, it's brilliant. Politically, it serves the interests of the right in two major respects. Number one, by linking the left to human rights, debunking human rights and civil rights and democracy, one is assuring a political victory in the next elections. And number two, no less significantly, one is finding a new excuse for not pursuing and implementing a two-state solution. So if you want to know about the timing serves the political interests of those in power in Israel today. They just forgot one thing, that Israelis love their democracy, and Jews throughout the world love their democracy, and there is a democratic awakening in Israel of the sort that we have not experienced in years. And we are joined by you who are saying being Jewish is being democratic today. And being pro-Israel is being pro-democracy today. And therefore, this has brought about a democratic backlash, which I think can and will prevail. And there's one last sentence. This is not just an Israeli issue. Jewish identity in the 21st century merges the humanity of the Jewish heritage together with the democratic experience in open societies. That is the future of Judaism, it is the future of Israel, and I believe it's the future of human beings. We can win, and we will win this one. Thank you very much.
I'm not going to take the time to go with questions and rounds of answers. I don't want to take that time away from your time to ask questions. If you can line up at the microphone if you have questions to ask, And while you are doing that, I'd like to put out a couple of questions that I have that the panelists may or may not choose to respond to when they're answering your questions. Just to think about whether you want to include this in any of your responses. The first one is that the title of this panel is Behind the Scenes, and I wonder if you'll find a chance to comment on how you work together, how you don't work together, what your issues may be with each other, your different organizations, NIF and ACRI and other progressive, pro-peace, pro-democracy organizations. You've got different tactics, you've got different ideas of how to get to where you want to go. So I think that we would all like to hear where you differ as well as where you are in alignment. The other question that occurs to me, since this is an American audience, how do Americans communicate, miscommunicate? How do you communicate or miscommunicate with Americans in developing your message, in persuading donors that you're doing the right thing? Israelis and Americans have lots of different attitudes on tactics and strategy. So how does the message you get from Americans influence you, and where do you think we're sort of not getting it? Because I think maybe in some sense Americans are part of the problem for your work and not only part of the solution. So you might comment on that. Okay, so we'll take your questions and make them questions. Thanks. Go ahead.
Hello. Hi. Thanks very much for coming. My name is Ilya Lazowski. I'm a student at the Fletcher School in Boston. And my question is for the panelists, as specifically as possible, to what extent do you believe the structure of the Israeli electoral system is responsible for the demise of the left in recent years, and are there any prospects for reforming it in a positive direction? Thank you.
Do you want to direct that to one of the panelists? Otherwise, one question is going to take 20 minutes.
Whoever wants to answer.
Okay. I designate you.
Why don't you take some questions?
Okay, fine.
I think it's
We'll take a couple of questions and then ask the panelists to respond.
I'm Matt Thomas from Brooklyn, New York, and there's one big difference, even at this conference, between Israel and America in terms of the liberal side, and that is that there's a lot of liberal Jews who go to synagogue and who are here at the conference. And I'm recently in Israel, and the division, the liberal Jewish community in Israel is very, very small. And I'm wondering about that difference and how we can, Dr. Rabbi Saperstein used the word God last night. Almost revolutionary in the J Street conference. So I'm wondering about your response to that in terms of the dialogue with Israel. I recently was in Israel, and I dare not use the word God with my secular friends in Israel.
Thank you. Okay, can you respond however you like, Danny, and then maybe Hagai and Naomi would like to have a brief response also. Then we'll take a couple more questions.
Just about the electoral system. Anyone who comes to Israel to visit, he said, what about your system? When are you replacing it? I won't blame Israel's problems on the system. When it works, it works. When it doesn't, when things don't work, they blame the system. As I said, the system is a reflection of the mood of the Israelis. They don't like to be together on so many issues. And they love to share their views and to share and to give their vote to so many parties. And eventually this system is bad because it creates a paralysis in terms of decision making. I think that making peace with when your party is only 20% of the parliament, of the voters, is extremely difficult. You need to find a consensus. What Jean-Jacques Rousseau called la volonté générale, the general will. And I'm asking myself, what is the will of the Israelis? If we are so fragmented, how can you make a decision about peace or about war? We cannot. That's why we are paralyzed. But I don't see anyone trying to change the system because the small satellites, the small parties, are dictatorial about their will to be what they are and to get from the big parties what they can get. You know what? And the Israelis have learned to live with it, with this system that is not doing well to Israel, but it reflects the character of the Israelis.
Thank you. Hagai?
with all the minuses of the system, one thing that is very clear that it's very representative. And in that sense, also, I think it's fair to say that many of the policies that we're now seeing implemented by the current government are a genuine representation of the people that have voted this government into power. That is not always the case, but in this case, I don't think we can say that there's really a distance, a significant distance, between the people's will and what they're getting, and actually, in some way, you can even claim that this government is underperforming in the context of what it was elected to do. That's actually the case. I think also we can think that like the last 2 years are some sort of like post-election poll on like how far down we've slipped down the slippery slope. Because as I've said, there's been a lot of push and shove, a lot of bills that they've tried to advance, and they reached almost the final stage of legislation, and then they evaporated or lost majority or passed with a very different version that doesn't really mean anything, and so on. So I think that also is something we can think about as some sort of ongoing representative poll of how bad things are. This is how bad things are. You can't pass these bills, you cannot make them into laws, but you can establish, further and further establish this atmosphere that human rights organizations and all democracy talk in the substantive way, not just elections once every 4 years in between the tyranny of the majority, but a democracy that respects the rights of minorities and protects human rights is something that is associated with treason, with being a fifth column, with being either Arab by birth or the new Arab, Arab by ideology, because you proclaim that Arabs are equal citizens of the State of Israel, and so on. So that's how bad things have become. In the thinking of behind the scenes, I'll share one aspect that has been difficult for ACRI to reach a conclusion on, and that was in the context of how closely we associate ourselves with political parties. We are a human rights NGO, we are not a political party, we never will be, but at these times we felt that perhaps new strategies are needed. The decision that we've made, and also other civil society organizations have made in the last major demonstration in Tel Aviv, the 20,000 strong demonstration, where there were political parties and there were civil society organizations together, was almost unprecedented in ACRI's history. We've been around since 1972. We never positioned ourselves in such a case, but we felt that the times are so difficult that they require from us difficult decisions. And our point was that by being in that demonstration, we're not associating ourselves with any specific political party, and we never will. And in that demonstration, you saw a coalition all the way from Kadima to the Arab parties and everyone in between, standing against what was trying to be advanced in the Knesset. We don't associate ourselves with any specific political party. Everyone that's part of that demonstration are associating themselves with the values that those demonstrators are fighting for. But for us, that was something that was new and different in the way we conduct ourselves. But in addition to the behind-the-scenes aspect, and there's so much pressure on us, being more and more transparent, as if we're not already that transparent, then I want to say just a few words, not just on the behind-the-scenes, but about the in-your-face aspects of what's happening. Because the bills are not passed, but the kind of language that the leadership, we're talking about senior members of Knesset, we're talking about the chairperson of legislation and law committee in the Knesset, and we're talking about many other senior MKs, and the kind of dogmatic, racist, anti-democratic language that is being used in the face of Arab MKs, in the face of guests of the committees, in the face of human rights activists, is unprecedented. And when an Arab MK is removed from the room because he is expressing his resent over the fact that the chairperson of the committee doesn't allow him to talk in a discussion that is focusing on a bill that will make it legal for certain communities to exclude Arabs from living in the same communal village with other people that are found to be socially compatible with the fabric of that village, and the Arab MK isn't allowed to speak and is removed from the room. And as he's saying, I'm going to return, you're going to hear from me, and another MK, a Jewish MK, is telling him, well, we'll let you come in if you will pass an admissions committee. That's the admissions committee bill. So if you will pass our admissions committee. And that's, I think, like the entire dogma of current day's racism in Israel. If we will find you to be sufficiently loyal, sufficiently Jewish, sufficiently in agreement with the way we want to conduct things, in the way we understand a Jewish democracy, which is a democracy for the Jews, right? Then we will let you in. And obviously, that's not the way that you conduct things in a democracy.
I'm going to go to the next question, Hagai. Naomi, do you want to weigh in or wait for the next question?
I'll wait for the next question.
Okay.
I asked my question.
Two more.
Okay.
I will answer your question about God. I am thinking about her.
Okay, two more questions.
I'm Lee Gordon from Portland, Oregon, one of the founders of Yad Bayad, Hand in Hand. We'll talk to Yad Bayad. My question is about, maybe it's directed at Donnie, but any of you could answer. It's about, the dichotomy that you portray between secular Israeli Jews and religious Jews. I'm very secular, but I think that in the religious community there is a wide spectrum, and there are many people, maybe they're a sizable minority who I think do view democratic values as important to them, along with the religious values. How can you, whether it's NIF or just the discourse in Israel, how can you reach out to them, not alienate them, not put every person who is religiously observant into the camp of anti-democratic values, because they are a sizable portion of the center of Israel. How do we win their support?
Thank you.
I'm Jesse Bacon. I'm the editor of The Only Democracy. My orange lanyard is over there
Bacon?
for press. Bacon, yeah. Like the tray, not like the former PM. And my question is for Dr. Chazan. Do you see a link between the demonization of NGOs in Israel and the demonization of supporters of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement?
Thank you. That should take up the rest of our time. Naomi, do you want to begin on that?
I actually want to begin on the question of behind the scenes and strategically dealing with the issue of how to prevent violations of human rights, attacks on human rights defenders, and the rehabilitation and revival of democratic values in Israel. Because I think that's the key issue we're talking about. And it is a strategic question, and Hagai, I think quite correctly pointed out that it's a multifaceted and multi-layered question. But the most important thing strategically is to understand that democracy and human rights and civil values are not a right-left issue. They are an issue of citizens. And therefore the critical thing is to unpack the correlation between right and anti-democratic, or between left and human rights, and to start spreading human rights into other elements and aspects and groups in Israeli society. So behind the scenes, to be quite honest, every time we have thwarted racist or para-fascist legislation, it has been as a result of shifting coalitions with critical members of the center of the right speaking out. And that is true also of religious members. And it is true also of Arab members. And it is true also of Russian-speaking members. The strategy is very clear. The Democratic Coalition does not completely overlap left political ideology. And if we get that message across through hardworking, and I heard some names that I know you don't particularly like in the American Jewish community, or you've gotten a lot of criticism from, mentioned here. But I want you to know that we have brought on board on critical questions that would turn Israel into a McCarthy state, McCarthyist state. We've gotten support from the Abe Foxmans and the Malcolm Hoenleins and the Jeremy Ben-Amis together. That's what it's about. Thinking strategically means being smart and understanding that lots of people care about democracy even when they don't agree with you on particular issues related to the conflict. And the more democratic they are, the faster the conflict's going to be resolved anyway. So I'm suggesting to think about it that way. That's the way we've approached it. I think you're going on the Hill on Tuesday. That's exactly what you're going to be doing. Okay?
Thank you, Naomi.
Just one word about religion. The New Israel Fund, 40% of our pluralism pool goes to modern Orthodox groups and to the most important feminist revolution taking place in Israel today, and that is among Orthodox Jewish women. So let's by the way, the second is among Arab women in Israel, and therefore, as somebody who paid dues to a Reconstructionist synagogue that turned reform in Jerusalem for the past 40 years, at Mevakshei Derech, I want you to know that we are only as secular as the strength of those who try to impose religious coercion on us.
I'd like to hear more from you if you all would like to on the religion issue. I think that we're all aware that the bus issue has been played and it's been a much bigger deal here than I think it has been in Israel. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Americans care a lot about gender-segregated buses. I don't know if Israelis care as much as we do, so that's one example of, we're from Mars and they're from Venus. You want to comment on that?
I want to say a word or two about the relationship between the religious and the secular. What started as a partnership between the secular and religious has become a rivalry on leadership. They want now to lead Israel. And I must say that Zionism and the creation of Israel was a secular revolution. And the religious were asked, what do you want in order to be part of the state? They said, we want three things. We want to deal with birth, circumcision. We want wedding and, God forbid, divorce. And we want death. We want to be the one who will be the last one for the burial. That should be religious, wedding should be religious, and the circumcision should be according to the rabbi. These three things had created the status quo between the state and religion. And now it has changed. What used to be small thing in order to define who's a Jew. These three things stand between Judaism and other things. They still get these three things. But the secular are getting, I think, impatient and have lost faith about religious thing. Then came the 67 war and the rabbis of the West Bank, the settlements. And for me, when I say about when I talk about this rivalry, I'm talking about hundreds of rabbis who live in the West Bank and who are facing Israel who are giving Israel the biggest challenge of its life in terms of they are powerful, they have hundreds of thousands of settlers, and in a way they decide who's going to be prime minister and if we have peace or not have peace. And I want just to say one thing about Yitzhak Rabin. So many rabbis have called for his, I don't say death, but for Oslo Accords. He was kind of, there was a verdict of the rabbis that Yitzhak Rabin should be punished. And when he was assassinated, and correct me if I'm wrong, Naomi, not one rabbi was called by the police to be investigated. They have a special status in Israeli society, and the problem, and maybe the solution, the problem is to find a new way how to treat religion, that someone can respect God and be democratic. Today, it looks as if we are in two different camps. If you have a kippah, you cannot come to a Rabin memorial, because they'll ask you, what do you do here? The religion...
Unless you're Avraham Borg.
Yes, of course, they are Borg. And that Borg is just one person. But what I'm saying is that we are departing from each other. And in order to live together, we have to find new formula that will allow believers to live in Israel in a normal way, and of course the secular, to go to synagogue without being asked, what happened? Have you become Choser B'Tshuva? And this is the way it is today. You cannot really cross the two camps without being asked questions. It should be that you can respect God and respect freedom and be democratic and live as a normal person. Today, I'm so sorry to say, it is so difficult.
Okay, we're going to take two more questions.
Three, because we need a woman fast.
Thank you so much. I'm Ruth Atkin. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area local. And we've had some, Hagai and Naomi in particular, have talked quite a bit about the new coalitions, the shifting sands, the absolute fight that's essential against the racist and fascist policies. The U.S. has similar struggles right now too, which I want to acknowledge. If you could share some of your latest strategical or tactical thinking about how to enhance the coalitions, how to break down some of the log jams, or if there's like one thing to focus on that could help turn the tide in terms of the movement towards pluralism, towards democracy. Is it tackling racism head on? Is it tackling the internal economic situation in the country? Just whatever your last thoughts are on that.
Let's take another one.
Yeah, I just had a question. This would be for any of the three of you. A lot of what I've been hearing this morning has been talking about attacking the democratic resurgence kind of from the top down, you know, through the Knesset, through NGOs and stuff. But I've been also hearing about a lot about what's happening from the bottom up in terms of the resurgence of democratic values and the resurgence of the left in Israel. And I'm wondering if you could maybe tell us what you have heard about the new things that are happening specifically that typify the resurgence of the left in Israel. Because I haven't heard a lot about it recently. So.
Let me add to that. In the story in the New Yorker this week about Haaretz, David Remnick talks about the collapse and the disappearance of the peace camp. And he doesn't talk about any resurgence. So I think you all have, I hope you have a different idea. It certainly looks different in this room. But so we have about 12 minutes. If you answer this round quickly, we can get to the last two questions. So do you want to begin, Hagai?
I think the connecting line between the various questions and the strategic answer, this may be a surprising one, is a suggestion that we need to be emotional. That's, I think, what we should be. And I want to start from Egypt in order to explain that. I think that what happened in Egypt and the way that it's been perceived in Israel is one of the deepest expressions of to what extent the perception of Israelis, of themselves and of their situation, is a perception of a fortress Israel against the world. Because true, Israel has fought wars with Egypt, and it is true, bloody wars. And it is true that no one really knows where New Egypt is headed. But the inability to, on the one hand, say, you know, we don't know where this is going. But on the other hand, we're hopeful and we're moved. And we think that this is a wonderful thing that our largest neighbor, its people, are fighting for the freedom. And we're crossing fingers for them. And we're moved to tears together with the people in Tahrir Square. And yes, we don't know where this is going. This could be dangerous. The inability to be in that position, and only to be in a position, 99% of commentators in Israel were about, this is Iran too, Mubarak made a mistake by not, being super aggressive with the demonstrators from day one, and like there's no Arabs cannot do democracy, and all that. And that was the only rhetoric that Israeli. This is dangerous. This is dangerous. That sense is the problem and also the solution. And Naomi spoke about that mongering of pessimism and fear, and the need to, if we continue to just see ourselves as in danger and in danger, then we continue to making the pessimistic, negative choices. Now, yes, true, there are dangers. There are dangers domestically, and there are dangers in the neighborhood, there are dangers internationally, and there's Iran, of course, and so on. But if Israel continues to make choices based on pessimism, then we know where that direction is going. It's going to put Israel on a further collision course with the rest of the world. It's going to put Israel on a further collision course with a growing number of its own citizens that are not accepting the kind of measures that the country must take in order to continue sustaining that sort of garrison state against the rest of the world reality. And we know where that road is going. The other alternative, the optimistic alternative, is risky. There's no alternative that doesn't include taking real risks. Again, in the context of the relationships amongst Israeli citizens, in the context of ending the occupation and beyond. But what will it take in order to make Israelis take those optimistic risks? Because really, there's no other game in town. That's the only path that Israel must go in that direction. And I think that if we are not emotional, if we are not strategically emotional, optimistic, galvanizing, celebrating, winning those rounds, and also continuing to talk about the vision, not about minutia improvements, but about the vision of full equality for everyone, and an end for the occupation, and nothing less than that, then if we're not doing that, we're not going to be sufficiently convincing, and Israelis are not going to be able to move beyond in order to change the reality in Israel.
Thanks, Hagai. Naomi, you may be having the last word.
I don't want to have the last word, but I do want to say something. I've actually taken up drinking a lot of tea in order to prevent somebody having a monopoly.
I actually recommend
over
vodka.
ideas. That was too dry. But I do want to talk about bottom up and top down, and I agree with Hagai about passion and emotion. But passion and emotion isn't enough. We have that in ample quotients and doses. We really do. And where you see it in Israel, you saw it last night. You saw Sarah Beninga from Sheikh Jarrah, and you're looking at Hagai Elad right now from Akri, and you will see during the course of the next 2 days Hagit Ofran from Peace Now, and you will see various representatives of